Chinaza Okoye stood outside the gate of the house her father built with his own 2 hands and watched her younger sister order the security men to throw her belongings into the rain. 6 days. That's how long it took after their father's burial for Nkiru to turn a locked family will into a weapon. 6 days for blood to become nothing. And by the time this story ends, you'll understand exactly why the ancestors say that what is stolen in darkness always returns to collect its debt in daylight. If stories like this grip you, stay till the end and don't forget to subscribe, because what Nkiru did to her sister was only the beginning of what will be done to her. Let me take you back to where it all started. Papa Emeka Okoye was not a rich man when he was young. He was a bricklayer in Amaldo, a quiet town tucked between palm plantations and a river that never dried even in the harshest harmattan. He built his wealth brick by brick, literally, laying foundations for other men's houses until one day he had enough to lay the foundation for his own empire. By the time Chinaza and Nkiru were teenagers, Papa Emeka owned 3 houses in Amaldo, a fleet of Okada bikes that other young men rode for him, 2 large cocoa farms, and a modest but growing transport business that ran buses between Amaldo and the capital. Papa Emeka was a hard man, but a fair one. He believed in only one thing above all else, that his daughters would never depend on any man to survive. A woman who cannot stand on her 2 own legs, he used to say, tapping his walking stick on the veranda floor, will kneel for any man who offers her a chair. He said it so often that the neighbors could recite it like a proverb. Chinaza was the elder daughter, quiet, sharp-eyed, the one who sat beside her father during business meetings from the age of 16, learning how to read contracts, how to negotiate with cocoa buyers, how to know when a man was lying by the way his eyes shifted to the left. She wasn't her father's favorite because she was pretty or charming. She was her favorite because she reminded him of herself. Nkiru was different. Nkiru was loud. Where Chinaza studied contracts, Nkiru studied fashion magazines smuggled from Lagos. She was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that made market women stop pounding yam to stare, and she knew it. She had learned early that a smile could open doors that hard work took years to open. It wasn't that Nkiru was lazy. She simply believed the world owed her something for existing so beautifully in it. Papa Emeka loved her fiercely, the way fathers often love their most fragile children, but he did not trust her with the business, not once. That distinction, the trust he gave to one daughter and withheld from the other, would become the crack that split their family in 2. Now, here's where the story gets interesting, because you'd think, wouldn't you, that Papa Emeka would have written a clear will, sat his daughters down, told them exactly what belonged to whom? But Papa Emeka was a superstitious man beneath his hard exterior. He believed that speaking too plainly about death invited it. So instead of gathering his daughters for an open conversation, he did something quieter, something almost secretive. He wrote his will alone in his study on a rainy night in October, 2 years before he died. He sealed it. He told only one person where it was kept, his lawyer and old friend Barrister Ozo Nadi. Or so he thought. Papa Emeka died on a Sunday morning in March, collapsing in his cocoa farm with a hoe still in his hand. The town of Amaldo wept for 3 days. Chinaza, 28 years old at the time, organized the burial with the precision her father had taught her. The caterers, the canopies, the traditional rites that had to be performed exactly right, or the elders would talk for years. Nkiru, 25, cried the loudest at the funeral, wore the most elaborate mourning attire, and accepted condolences from every wealthy family friend with the practiced grace of someone who had already quietly begun planning her next move. Because here is the truth nobody in Amaldo knew yet. 3 weeks before Papa Emeka died, Nkiru had discovered where the will was kept. She She hadn't gone looking for it out of curiosity. She had gone looking for it because she was drowning. Nkiru had secretly married a man named Obinna Chukwu 2 years earlier, a man Papa Emeka despised, a man who ran a car dealership that was nothing more than a front for importing stolen vehicles from the port in Lagos. Papa Emeka had forbidden the relationship the moment he found out, and Nkiru, terrified of losing her father's love and her father's money in one blow, had married Obinna in secret and told no one, not even Chinaza. Obinna's business had collapsed 6 months before Papa Emeka's death, after a shipment was seized by customs officials. He owed men in Lagos, dangerous men, an amount that made Nkiru's hands shake every time she thought about it. And so, one evening, while visiting her father under the pretense of bringing him pepper soup, Nkiru slipped into his study while he slept on the veranda and searched until she found the small brass key that opened his private drawer. Inside, she found the will. She did not read it fully that night. She only saw enough to understand a single line underlined in her father's careful handwriting that the business, the farms, and 2 of the 3 houses were to go to Chinaza, with Nkiru receiving only the smallest of the 3 houses and a modest cash sum to be released only upon her demonstrating financial responsibility for no less than 1 year under her sister's guidance. Under her sister's guidance. Nkiru put the will exactly where she found it, said nothing, smiled through the rest of that evening, but something in her had already curdled, like milk left too long in the Amaldo sun.
Do you see it now? Do you see how a story that looks simple on the surface, a greedy sister stealing an inheritance, is never actually that simple? Nkiru wasn't just greedy. Nkiru was drowning, and desperate people do desperate things. And desperate things are always more complicated than they first appear. Keep that in mind. It matters later. When Papa Emeka died 3 weeks after that discovery, Nkiru did not waste time. She knew Barrister Nadi held a copy of the will, and she knew the original was in that drawer. What she needed was time. Time to act before anyone official got involved. And so the night before the burial, while the house was full of relatives sleeping on mats in every room and grief hung thick like smoke, Nkiru crept once more into her father's study. She took the original will, she burned it in a small fire behind the boys' quarters, watching the corners curl black before the flames ate through her father's handwriting entirely. Then she did something even more dangerous. Obinna, it turned out, was not only a car dealer with underworld debts. His younger brother, Chinedu, worked as a clerk in the very courthouse where Papa Emeka's estate would eventually be processed. Nkiru met Chinedu in secret 2 nights after the burial. She did not ask him kindly. She threatened to expose an old fraud case connecting Obinna's dealership to Chinedu's office, a case that would end Chinedu's career and possibly send him to prison. Chinedu, cornered, agreed to help her draft and file a forged will, one that named Nkiru as sole beneficiary of everything, the houses, the farms, the business, all of it, with Chinaza mentioned only once, receiving a token sum of 200,000 naira as an acknowledgement of her years of service to the family. Service. As if Chinaza had been a housemaid all those years, not a daughter who built half the empire alongside her father with her own 2 hands. The forged document itself was not enough on its own. It needed a registry stamp to look official, and it needed to move through the system quickly before anyone with real authority came asking questions. For that, Chinedu brought in a registry clerk named Patrick Effiong, a heavy-set, nervous man he'd known since secondary school, who agreed, for a cut of the eventual inheritance, to backdate the filing and push it through without the usual scrutiny. Between the 2 of them, the forged will was made to appear as though it had been drawn up just 1 month before Papa Emeka's death, conveniently after the real will Nkiru had already burned. Barrister Enadi's copy, the true one, sat locked in his office safe in the state capital, 2 hours away, and Barrister Enadi himself had just traveled to Abuja for his own daughter's wedding, expecting to be gone 3 weeks at most. Nkiru knew she didn't have long. 3 weeks, if she was fortunate. That was the window she needed. Now, if you're watching this and thinking, surely someone would have questioned it, surely Chinaza would have fought back immediately, you're right to think that. And she did try. But grief is a strange thing. It slows you down exactly when you need to move fastest. While Chinaza was still organizing the second phase of burial rites, the traditional ceremonies that happen weeks after the church burial, Nkiru had already visited a different lawyer, a young and hungry one named Barrister Solomon Ude, who didn't ask too many questions about why a grieving daughter needed her father's estate transferred so urgently, so long as his fee was paid up front. By the 6th day after the burial, Nkiru had legal paperwork, forged but official-looking, stamped and signed, declaring her the sole inheritor of everything their father had built. And on that 6th day, in front of neighbors who had known both girls since they were children playing in the dust outside the compound, Nkiru stood at the gate of her father's largest house and told her own sister to leave. "This is my house now," Nkiru said, her voice flat, her eyes refusing to meet Chinaza's. "Papa left it to me. You can go and check with the lawyer yourself if you don't believe me." Chinaza stood in the rain, because of course it was raining, a Maudu rain that fell like judgment, and stared at her sister as though seeing her for the first time. "Nkiru," she said quietly, "you know that isn't true. You know Papa would never—" "Papa is dead," Nkiru snapped, and something flickered behind her eyes, something that almost looked like shame before it hardened again into resolution. "And the living have to survive. Go and start your own life, China. You always thought you were better than me anyway, better with Papa's business, better with his trust. Well, let's now see how well you do without any of it." The security men Chinaza herself had hired 2 years earlier, men who ate at her table and called her Auntie China with genuine affection, looked at the ground, unable to meet her eyes as they carried her boxes into the road. That was the moment. That was the moment this story truly begins, because everything before it was just the setup, the falling of the first domino. What happens next is where the real story lives. If this kind of betrayal makes your chest tight, if you're already angry on Chinaza's behalf, that's good. That means you understand exactly why this story matters. Hit subscribe now before we continue, because trust me, you do not want to miss where this goes. Chinaza spent that first night in the home of her best friend, Amarachi, a school teacher who lived in a small 2-room flat on the edge of town. She sat on Amarachi's threadbare couch, soaked to the bone, and did not cry. Amarachi kept waiting for the tears, kept a box of tissues ready on the table, but they never came. Instead, Chinaza sat very still, her jaw tight, staring at nothing. "Say something," Amarachi finally whispered. "She burned it," Chinaza said. Her voice was so quiet Amarachi almost missed it. "I know she did. There's no other explanation. Papa's will could never have said what that paper said. I sat beside him for years. I know how his mind worked. He would never leave me with nothing, and Nkiru with everything, not after everything he said about her judgment." "Then fight it. Go to the police. Go to another lawyer." Chinaza laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "With what money, Amara? She has the houses. She has the accounts. She has papers that look official. I have the clothes on my back and whatever's in that box outside." She paused. "And even if I found a lawyer willing to help me for free, do you know how long that would take? Months, maybe years. And in that time, she'll sell the farms, drain the accounts, do whatever she needs to do to make sure there's nothing left to reclaim, even if I win." This is important. Pay attention here, because this is where most people expect this story to become a simple courtroom drama. A wronged woman fighting through the justice system, a satisfying trial, a judge banging a gavel. But that's not what happened. And that's not what makes this story worth telling. Because Chinaza did something far more interesting. She disappeared. Not literally. She didn't run away from Amaudo, but she went quiet. For months, Chinaza said almost nothing about the inheritance. She took a job as a bookkeeper for a small trading company 2 towns over, using skills her father had drilled into her since childhood. She rented a single room with Amarachi's help, She watched from a careful distance as word trickled back to her about what Nkiru was doing with the empire she'd stolen. And the word was not good, not for Nkiru. Obina, freed from the pressure of his debts thanks to his wife's sudden windfall, quickly proved that a man who cannot manage money when he has none cannot manage it when he has plenty either. He paid off the dangerous men in Lagos, yes, but then he began spending recklessly: a new car, expensive suits, investments in schemes that Chinaza, watching from the shadows, recognized immediately as scams her father would have spotted in 5 minutes. The transport business, which had run smoothly under Chinaza's careful oversight for years, began to falter within months. Drivers who weren't paid on time started skipping routes. Buses that needed maintenance sat broken down because Nkiru, who had never once looked at a maintenance schedule in her life, didn't know they needed servicing until they stopped moving altogether. The cocoa farm suffered worse. Papa Emeka's farms had thrived because of a careful system, specific workers who knew the land, a rotation schedule for planting, relationships with buyers that Chinaza herself had cultivated over years of sitting beside her father at negotiations. Nkiru fired half the experienced workers within the first 2 months, replacing them with cheaper laborers who didn't know the land because Obina convinced her it would save money. The next harvest was the worst in a decade. Word of all this reached Chinaza slowly, in pieces, through Amarachi and through market women who still remembered her kindly. And here is the thing that surprised even Chinaza herself. She felt no joy hearing it. She thought she would. She thought watching her sister's stolen empire crumble would taste like justice. Instead, it tasted like grief all over again. Grief for the business her father had built, now being dismantled by people who didn't understand what it had cost him to build it. But there's a twist coming, and I promise you, it's not the one you are expecting. Because while Nkiru's public empire crumbled, something else was happening in private, something Chinaza didn't discover until months later. Barrister Uzo Nadi, Papa Emeka's old friend and true lawyer, had planned to be away only 3 weeks for his daughter's wedding in Abuja. But shortly after the ceremony, his daughter fell seriously ill, a complication that required extended hospital care, and the old barrister stayed on, entirely consumed with his daughter's recovery, entirely disconnected from Amaudo. 3 weeks stretched into months. It was only after his daughter finally recovered, nearly 8 months after he'd first left, that Barrister Nadi returned home and began catching up on everything he'd missed, completely unaware that his old friend had died, that a forged will had circulated, that everything had already fallen apart in his absence. One of the first things he did, out of pure habit and old friendship, was to try and call Papa Emeka to invite him to a small Thanksgiving gathering for his daughter's recovery. The number rang and rang. Eventually, a neighbor picked up and delivered the news that broke the old barrister's heart. His friend of 30 years had been dead for nearly 8 months. Barrister Nadi came to Amaudu the following week. He came first out of grief, wanting to visit the grave of his old friend. But something nagged at him the entire drive, a memory, a responsibility he'd nearly forgotten in the chaos of his daughter's illness. The will. He had a copy locked in his office safe. He had never released it, never even mentioned it to anyone, because he'd been gone the entire time the estate was supposedly being settled. When he arrived in Amaudo and began asking questions, what he learned horrified him. He learned that a will had already been processed, a will he had never drafted, never seen, never notarized. He learned Chinasa, the daughter he'd watched grow up, sitting beside her father, learning the family business, had been cast out with nothing. And he learned that Nkiru now controlled everything, though from what he was hearing around town, controlled was becoming a generous word for what was actually happening. The crumbling, the mismanagement, the slow bleeding out of everything Papa Emeka had spent a lifetime building. Barrister Nadi did not go to Nkiru first. He came to find Chinasa. He found her in her small rented room, thinner than he remembered, but with the same sharp, watchful eyes her father used to praise. When he told her what he had, the true original notarized copy of Papa Emeka's will, safely locked away for months while everyone believed a forgery, Chinasa sat very still for a long moment. Then, for the first time since the night she'd been thrown into the rain, she cried. Not from sadness, but from something closer to relief, the kind that comes after holding your breath so long you'd forgotten what air felt like. But, and here's where I need you to lean in close, because this is the part of the story that changes everything. Chinasa did not immediately storm into town waving the will and demanding justice. She thought about it. She thought about it for 3 full days, because something Barrister Nadi had told her stuck in her mind, buried in the middle of all his explanations. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he'd also heard rumors that Nkiru's husband Obinna had returned to his old underworld connections in Lagos, taking new risks to cover the losses from the failing business, and that these were far more dangerous men than the ones he'd owed before. Rumors that Nkiru herself had recently been seen in the market, thinner, quieter, a shadow of the confident woman who'd stood at that gate months earlier. Chinasa realized something in those 3 days of thinking. If she simply marched in with the real will and had Nkiru arrested for forgery, which she absolutely could do, which she had every right to do, it would satisfy something in her chest, yes, but it would also mean her sister, her only sibling, the girl she used to share a bed with as children during thunderstorms, would go to prison, and whatever was left of the family business, whatever remained after months of mismanagement, would likely collapse entirely in the chaos of a criminal trial, with Obinna's new dangerous debt still looming over what remained of the family name. There had to be another way, a way that brought justice without total destruction, a way that made Nkiru face what she'd done, truly face it, rather than simply disappearing into a prison cell while blaming everyone but herself. So Chinasa did something almost nobody expected, something that even Amarachi thought was a mistake at first. She went to Nkiru, alone, unannounced. She found her sister at the smallest of the 3 houses, the very house Nkiru had once dismissively called the token Chinasa was supposed to receive. Nkiru had moved there herself, in fact, weeks earlier, after Obinna's newest scheme collapsed and the largest house, her father's house, had been seized as collateral against one of his failed investments. The empire, built over 30 years of a bricklayer's careful labor, had been reduced in under a year to a single small house with peeling paint and a leaking roof. When Nkiru opened the door and saw her sister standing there, her face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, fear, and then, indistinctly, shame. She tried to close the door. Chinasa put her hand against it, gently, not forcing it, just holding it open. "I'm not here to hurt you," Chinasa said quietly. "I'm here to talk." What followed inside that small dim house was the conversation this entire story had been building toward. And I want you to really sit with this next part, because it's not what you'd expect from a story with this title. Nkiru broke down almost immediately. The confident mask she'd worn at the gate months earlier was gone entirely, replaced by someone exhausted, hollowed out by fear and guilt she'd been carrying alone. She told Chinasa everything: the secret marriage to Obinna, the debts, the desperation that had driven her into her father's study that night, the forged document, Chinedu and Patrick's involvement, all of it. She told Chinasa about the men from Lagos who had come to the house just 2 weeks earlier, men with cold eyes who made it clear that Obinna's new debts would be collected one way or another, death or blood. "I thought money would fix everything," Nkiru whispered, her hand shaking around a cup of cold tea she hadn't touched. "I thought if I had what you had, the business, the trust, Papa's confidence, I would finally be enough. But I didn't know how to run any of it, China. I didn't know the buyers. I didn't know the workers. I didn't know when the bosses needed servicing. I just knew how to want things. And now everything Papa built is gone, and it's my fault. And there are men outside my door threatening to hurt my husband, and I don't know what to do."
Here is the moment where you might expect Chinasa to feel vindicated, to say, "I told you so," to walk away and let her sister drown in the consequences of her own choices. And for a moment, just a moment, that temptation did flicker across Chinasa's face.
But then she remembered something her father used to say, something she hadn't thought about in months. A woman who cannot stand on her own two legs will kneel for any man who offers her a chair. She looked at her sister, not the confident thief who'd stood at the gate, but the frightened, desperate woman crying in a crumbling house, and she understood, finally, the difference between the two. Nkiru had never learned to stand on her own legs. Papa Emeka had been so focused on protecting the business, so certain that Nkiru wasn't ready, that he'd never actually taught her how to become ready. He'd shut her out instead of building her up, and that exclusion had created exactly the kind of desperation that led her into that study with a stolen key. It didn't excuse what Nkiru did. Chinaza made that very clear, her voice hard as she said it. Nothing excused burning a man's dying wishes, threatening an innocent clerk to forgery, throwing her own sister into the street with nothing. But understanding why something happened, Chinaza realized, was different from forgiving it, and different still from deciding what to do next. Before we go further into how this resolves, let me pause here, because we're at the heart of the story now, and I want to remind you, if you haven't already, to subscribe. Stories like this one, stories with real twists, real complicated humanity instead of flat good guys and bad guys, are exactly what this channel is about. There's more coming, and it's not the ending you're expecting. Chinaza laid out her terms that evening, and they were not gentle, but they were fair. Fairer, honestly, than Nkiru had any right to expect. She told her sister she had the real will. She told her she could go to the police that very night if she chose. And then she told her what she was going to do instead. She would use the true will to reclaim everything that remained. The seized house would need to be fought for separately through actual legal channels, since Obina's debts were a separate matter from the estate itself. But the surviving assets, the smaller house, whatever remained of their accounts, would legally revert to Chinaza as the true inheritor. The 200,000 naira the fake document had dismissively offered her meant nothing now. It had never even been paid, and Chinaza waved it away without a second thought the moment she said it aloud. It belonged to a fake will, and fake wills pay nothing at all. Nkiru would not go to prison, not because Chinaza was weak, but because she refused to let her father's legacy become a court case that dragged the family name through headlines for years, while Obina's Lagos creditors circled like vultures over whatever remained. But, and this was the condition Nkiru had to accept completely, with no negotiation, Nkiru would work. Truly work, the way Chinaza had worked beside their father for a decade. She would come to whatever remained of the business, starting from the bottom, learning bookkeeping, learning the buyers, learning the workers, learning everything her father had never bothered to teach her because he had assumed she wasn't capable. She would earn a real place in what remained, not through inheritance, but through the same sweat and discipline their father had built the empire on in the first place. And Obina would have no place in the business at all. If he wanted to face the men from Lagos, he would face them as himself, not hiding behind his wife's stolen money. As for Chinedu and Patrick, the two men who helped forge and file the false will, Chinaza made a separate decision about them the following week once she'd calmed enough to think clearly. She did not report them to the police, but she made sure, through Barrister Nadi, that both men were formally confronted with what they'd done, made to sign sworn statements admitting the forgery, statements that would sit quietly on file, insurance against either of them ever trying something similar again. Patrick, terrified of losing his job entirely, resigned from the registry office on his own within the month and left Amaudo for good. Chinedu, still bound to his brother's chaos, distanced himself from Obina entirely once the threats from Lagos intensified, and was never seen playing a role in the family's affairs again. Barrister Solomon Ode, the young lawyer who rushed Nkiru's fraudulent paperwork through without asking questions, found his name quietly flagged when Barrister Nadi reported the matter to the State Bar Association. It didn't end his career outright, but it followed him, the kind of quiet mark that made established firms hesitant to work with him afterward, a consequence built entirely from his own willingness to look away from the truth for a fee. Nkiru agreed to every time Chinaza laid out. What choice did she have? But something in the way she agreed, quietly, without argument, with genuine tears rather than performance, told Chinaza that something had actually broken open in her sister, some illusion about the world owing her comfort, and beneath that wreckage of an illusion was perhaps the beginning of someone real. Now here's the twist within the twist, the part of this story that even I find remarkable when I think about it. Barrister Nadi, upon hearing how Chinaza had chosen to handle things, mercy over vengeance, rebuilding over destruction, offered something unexpected. He knew people. 30 years of legal practice in the region meant he knew judges, knew police commissioners, knew men with influence. When word reached him about the Lagos creditors threatening Obina, and by extension threatening the family, he made a few careful calls. Obina's debts were tied to a car smuggling operation that Nigerian customs had been investigating for over a year. Barrister Nadi didn't need to invent anything. He simply made sure the right information reached the right investigators. Within a month, several of the men who had threatened Obina were arrested in an unrelated customs fraud sweep. Unrelated on paper, though Obina suspected correctly that the old barrister's hand had guided the timing. Obina, terrified and finally humbled, left Amaondo entirely. He went to stay with relatives in the east, and though he and Nkiru remained legally married, the marriage existed in name only from that point forward. Nkiru, freed from the man whose ambitions had driven her into desperation in the first place, threw herself into rebuilding what remained of the family business with an intensity that surprised everyone who remembered the vain, careless girl she used to be. It was not easy, it was not fast. For close to 2 years, Chinanza and Nkiru worked side by side, rebuilding the cocoa farms, retraining new workers, slowly repairing relationships with buyers who had lost trust in the family name after months of chaos. There were arguments, plenty of them. There were nights Nkiru broke down under the weight of learning skills a decade too late. Nights Chinaza had to fight the urge to simply take over and do everything herself the way she always had. Because part of the deal, the whole point of the deal, was that Nkiru had to actually learn to stand. And slowly, painfully, she did. By the time 3 full years had passed since the night Nkiru first discovered where their father kept his will, the business hadn't fully returned to what it once was. Some things, once lost, take longer than a story can capture to fully rebuild. But the bosses ran on schedule again. The cocoa farms produced a respectable harvest, not their best, but solid, growing. And something else had grown too, something neither sister expected. A real relationship between them, forged not from blood alone, but from the fire they'd both walked through, from honesty finally spoken instead of secrets kept. One evening, close to 4 years since that terrible night in the rain, the two sisters sat together on the veranda of their father's original house, reclaimed finally, after Chinaza won the separate legal battle over the seized property. A battle made easier by Obina's total absence and his crimes being a matter of public record. Nkiru looked out over the compound their father had built with his own hands, the same compound she'd once stood in and told her sister to leave. "I think about that night all the time," Nkiru said quietly. "The rain, your face. I keep waiting for you to bring it up, to throw it at me, and you never do." Chinaza was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade over the palm trees at the edge of the property. "What good will it do?" she finally said. "You already know what you did. You've spent years proving you understand it. Papa used to say, a debt repaid in silence is worth more than one repaid with excuses." Nkiru's eyes filled, but she didn't cry the way she used to. The performative tears of a girl who thought crying was a tool. These were quieter, harder earned. "I don't think I ever really knew what it meant to stand on my own legs until I lost everything and had to learn from nothing. I used to think Papa loved you more. I understand now. He didn't love you more. He trusted you more because you did the work to earn it. I never did the work. I just wanted the reward. You are doing the work now, Chinaza said simply. And that in the end is the real heart of this story. Not the theft itself, not even the forgiveness, but the slow, unglamorous, difficult work of actually becoming someone worthy of what you want, instead of simply taking it and hoping the taking will be enough. Nkiru never escaped what she'd done. In small ways, the town of Amaundo remembered. Some elders still whispered about the girl who forged her father's will whenever her name came up, and that whisper never fully faded, not even years later. Regret, real regret, doesn't come with an expiration date. Nkiru carried it quietly for the rest of her life, a permanent weight beneath everything she built afterward, a reminder every single day of the sister she'd betrayed and the father whose trust she'd violated before he was even cold in the ground. That was her true punishment. Not prison, not public shame, but the daily knowledge of exactly who she'd been willing to become when desperation offered her a shortcut, and the daily work of proving, to herself more than anyone, that she could become someone different. Chinaza, for her part, never fully trusted her sister again in the effortless way she once had. Some cracks once formed simply become part of the structure, weathered but never invisible. But trust, she learnt, isn't the same as love, and it isn't the same as family. She loved her sister. She built a life alongside her, imperfect but real. And every single day she woke up in her father's house running the business he taught her to run, she understood something that took her years of pain to fully grasp: that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes, justice is simply making sure the truth survives long enough to matter, and making sure the people who wronged you have to live every day inside the consequences of what they chose. That's it. That's the whole story of Chinaza and Nkiru Okoye, two sisters torn apart by an inheritance and slowly, painfully, put back together by truth. If this story moved you, if you felt that tightness in your chest when Nkiru threw her sister into the rain, and that quiet relief when the truth finally came home, then you already know exactly why stories like this matter. They are not just entertainment, they are reminders. Reminders that what's stolen in darkness rarely stays hidden, that greed always has a price even when it looks like victory at first, and that the people who wrong us are usually more broken than we realize, even when that brokenness never excuses what they did. Before you go, I want you to do something for me. If you made it this far, if this story kept you glued the way we promised it would, hit that subscribe button right now. There's so many more stories like this waiting for you. Stories of betrayal, of hidden motives, of families torn apart and painstakingly rebuilt, all pulled from the rich, complicated soul of African storytelling. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next one, and leave a comment below. Tell me, honestly, would you have forgiven Nkiru the way Chinaza did, or would you have chosen differently? Until next time, remember what the elders of Amaundo still say, generations after Papa Emeka Okoye was laid to rest beneath his own cocoa trees. The earth never forgets who dug the grave, and it never forgets who filled it back in with honest hands.